Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you joining us from the US. Welcome to the third edition of the run-up to the US elections, Transatlantic Expectations. My name is Iana Maisuradze, and I'm the Junior Policy Analyst at the Europe in the World program here at the European Policy Center. Thank you all for joining us today. 2024 is set to be the biggest electoral year in history, with over half of the global population called to cast their ballots. No date opens a more momentous crossroads than the 5th of November in 2024. The outcome of the US elections could not only affect the future of liberal democracy and its institutions, but may also redefine transatlantic relations and our security environment in fundamental ways. Today, in this online policy dialogue, we will address domestic and international trends underpinning the run-up to the elections. We will focus on the Trump trials and its effect on US elections. We will discuss the results of the European Parliament elections and its impact on transatlantic relations. We will discuss also upcoming Republican and Democratic national conventions, as well as Biden-Trump debate, and NATO Summit in Washington, D.C. We have an excellent panel to discuss these issues. Ambassador João Vale de Almeida, EPC Senior Advisor and Visiting Fellow at the Cambridge University, Mrs. Frances Burwell, Distinguished Fellow at the Europe Center of the Atlantic Council, and last but not least, Ricardo Borges Castro, Visiting Scholar at the College of Europe in Bruges. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Before I pass the floor to our first speaker, let me give some housekeeping rules. Our session today lasts for 60 minutes. I will start with a few opening questions to the speakers, and then we will engage in a conversation. Afterwards, I will open the digital floor to the audience for a question and answer session, and then we will wrap it up. You can ask questions in the chat or raise your hand, and I will ask my colleagues to bring you in. Please keep your questions or comments short, so we can quickly read them and share it with the rest of the audience. So without further ado, let me turn to our panelists, and let's start from discussing the results of the European Parliament elections and its impact on transatlantic relations. Mr. Ambassador Vale de Almeida, maybe you can tell us more a bit about this.
Thank you, Iana. Hello to my good friends, Fran and Ricardo. It's good to see you both again and keep tracking of US elections, which is always an exciting endeavor. Right, this time we have also exciting developments in Europe. We just had our European Parliament elections in the 27 countries of the EU, and I think the first thing I'll say is that we are both starting a new cycle, right, or about to start a new cycle in the US, a few months down the road in Europe in the coming months, because this election triggers the whole process of appointment of the top leadership of the EU institutions. So maybe until November or December, we'll be in this transition mode, and then the US will come in. So it's interesting to sort of follow in parallel the two processes. Let me say a few words, but of course I look forward to other comments from the panel and the audience. The first thing I would say is that the results, in my view, represent stability at the core coalition that has been supporting the European project in the last years and even decades. And this coalition is basically formed by the center-right, the European People's Party, the center-left, the Socialists and Democrats, and the Renew Europe, or the liberal family in Europe. They may have here and there been supported by other elements of the political spectrum, particularly the Greens, but this has been the core of the support for the European project. The results confirm that they will keep a majority, not a huge majority, but a comfortable and sufficient majority to continue to do what they've been doing. So there are a few risks. You never know. This is a democratic process. Each parliamentarian has a vote and can decide on his own or her own. But I think it's a reasonable expectation to think that there will be stability. This means, in my view, also to a large extent, stability on foreign policy. support Ukraine, rejecting Putin's aggressive behavior, largely in favor of further European efforts on defense and security and foreign policy, and to a large extent a US favorable political stance. But we should not be under no illusion that this core coalition will be under pressure from the left and from the right. And transatlantic relations may be impacted by that. If I take the left side, it will be more on the economic front, it will be more on the human rights front. If I take the right side, it's also economic, because sometimes they join views in terms of protectionism and other aspects, but particularly regarding Ukraine and Russia, where we have in the far right a whole school of thought which is closer to Putin. So there will be pressure under this coalition, but I think there is, at least I hope, there will be a solid majority in favor of, for instance, engaging with the United States if President Biden is re-elected. If former President Trump is the new president, things will be more complicated, and this will encourage part of our far right and the Eurosceptic movements to be more vocal. The second point I would say is that while we have, or at least I expect, to have a certain degree of stability in Brussels and the institutions and the core of the European system, there will be less stability in some of our member states. And some of them will be particularly less stable, and I think of France and Germany in particular. And because France and Germany are not unimportant member states, this can have an impact on relations with the United States. If I take the case of France, there will be elections in a few weeks. We don't know exactly what will happen. These elections will take place ahead of the G7 and NATO Summit. So this will make President Macron's capability to project his own agenda make it more difficult. So this is not to be underestimated in terms of, there's also the Ukraine Peace Summit in the meantime, where Macron is supposed to be. If you take Germany, Chancellor Scholz has suffered a huge defeat. There is no expectations of immediate elections in Germany, but still, if you take these two cases, you have two important leaders on the European camp that come out of these elections considerably weakened. So this is something that our American friends will have to take in consideration, because it may impact the way we discuss and with the United States. The third point to say is that my expectation is that Ursula von der Leyen could continue to be the president of the Commission. She has been the anchor of EU-US relationship. President Biden has clearly recognized her as the person of contact in Brussels. And if she wins, I think she will remain very much committed to that. Of course, if former President Trump wins, things will be more difficult. I also see the coming up in importance of Warsaw and Rome. Luckily, these two leaders, Donald Tusk and Giorgia Meloni, are very much anti-Putin and pro-US. So I think here it's good news. But clearly, these two capitals and these two leaders will play a more important role in the future. My last comment is what kind of message are we sending to Moscow and Beijing with the results of these elections? I think they will see us more divided than before, and they will see us weakened as compared to the previous situation. So the political message to our partners, let's put it this way, interlocutors in Moscow and Beijing is not necessarily a good one, and they will see instability in the US, in the EU system. They see a degree of instability in the US system in the run-up to the elections as well. So I think we should be attentive to the way we interact with Moscow and Beijing to avoid weaken our case even further. So I'll stop here in terms of general view of the outcome of the elections, seen from the angle of transatlantic relations.
Thank you, Ambassador, for this very comprehensive overview of what is happening in the EU after the European elections vis-a-vis transatlantic relations. Divide and weaken EU, you mentioned, and we come to the EU. But for now, let me turn to the US and ask Mrs. Burwell about the Trump trials, the cases that made it to the headlines all over all over the world. What will happen after all the trials are completed? What will be the impact of the Trump trials on the US elections?
Well, I think I sound a bit like a broken record. This is our third iteration of this conversation, and I'm going to say yet again that it's too early to know. It is just, it was just only May 31st that we had the verdict, 34 counts of guilty on felony charges. I would say that the speed with which the jury returned that verdict surprised a number of commentators, as did the fact that they found him guilty on all. But it hasn't notably shaken true believers in Trump. We have seen the very beginnings of a shift in polls, and I would caution everyone to be careful to look for the date that the poll is in the field, because we are talking about such a recent event. But there was a poll released over the weekend by CBS and YouGov. It was taken June 5th through 7th, and it shows Biden leading Trump in all of the swing states, but only by 50 to 49%, which is within the margin of error. But it's the first time that he's been ahead, even though sometimes Trump has led within the margin of error. So I think we need to be a little bit skeptical right now. I think for some voters, the view has become stronger that Trump is chaotic. And we will see some people fall away because of that. Will they fall away in the right states and in the key places where President Biden needs them to assure his reelection? That is not at all clear yet. We do have, yesterday, we had the pre-sentencing interview for former President Trump. My mind is boggled that I'm even saying that phrase. But this is when he meets with his parole officer, for those of you who watch American TV dramas. And he was given two special exceptions. He was able to do it by video, and he was able to have his lawyer present. The sentencing hearing is to determine whether there is remorse, whether there is an understanding of what you did wrong, and it plays into the judge's decision about sentencing. The sentencing will come on July 11th, and I think that it is very unlikely, from everything that I've understood from legal experts, that these crimes would lead to time in jail. There is an outside chance that there would be, because Trump is unlikely to show remorse in his, if we can all imagine him talking to the probationary officer, and the degree of remorse that he has shown in public has been totally nil. And because also he has threatened officers of the court and their families, et cetera, on social media. But on July 11th, we're going to have this bizarre comparison where we will have President Biden at the NATO Summit in Washington, meeting with world leaders. And on the other part of your TV screen, computer screen, will be President Trump being sentenced. So I think that we don't know what impact that is going to have. Clearly, those who are strongly in support of President Trump believe that this whole thing was politicized, organized by Biden, et cetera. We also have, just 4 days after the sentencing, on July 15th, we have the Republican convention convening. and this will be the Trump show. So we expect it to be like the rallies that he has. We don't know who else yet will speak. I'm sure that it will be a list of, people who are under consideration for the vice president, et cetera, and other supporters. So we expect that to be quite a lively convention. I will say that. The Democratic convention is not until August 19th, so there's quite a gap. Also in the interim, later this month, we have June 27th, we have the debate between the two presidential candidates, or I should say presumed candidates, because neither of them will have been finalized by their party conventions. And we really don't know what's going to happen. In the debate in 2020, Biden did well against Trump, but we just don't know. We just don't know. So those are things to watch. You asked about the other cases against President Trump, former President Trump. So there are 4 cases. The hush money one is now over, except for the sentencing. He is a convicted felon and possibly not able to vote in Florida, his home state. As for the secret documents case, the mishandling of secret documents, this has been delayed repeatedly, with the judge taking on board various appeals that the defense has asked for. Later this month, she's going to have a hearing to determine if the prosecutor, Jack Smith, was lawfully appointed to prosecute this case. And she's going to unusually allow outside parties to participate, which means that it will be a lengthy hearing. This case was always going to take a long time because there are certain conditions when you handle secret documents, and both the defense and the prosecution will have to be cleared to handle these documents, and potentially members of the jury. So I think this was always going to be a lengthy procedure, but it's becoming even longer. Georgia, we have the state case. That's important that it is the state case about election interference, because should Trump be elected, he cannot just order the Justice Department to abandon that case. However, as you have undoubtedly read, there has been a lot of issues with moving forward with this case because of the district attorney and her apparent relationship with the prosecutor. And now we're waiting for yet another appeal that is designed to disqualify her. And it's not at all clear that that appeal will be resolved before the November election. As for the US case on the insurrection on January 6th, that has been awaiting the Supreme Court decision on the extent of presidential immunity for some time. And you may recall that many were surprised that the Supreme Court even took this case. But at any rate, it should come in July, in June or July. So almost any day. In fact, during this whole time when we have date after date of Trump's his sentencing, and the debate with Biden, et cetera, and everything like that going on, we could get the Supreme Court decision on this. And then we will know whether that case can go forward or not. But the situation that is emerging is that none of the other cases are now likely to hit the point where you have Trump sitting at the defense desk in court before the election. And so should Trump be elected, we can anticipate that one of his major early objectives will be to make it impossible for the cases to go forward. So having said all that, in our very convoluted electoral roadmap here, I think we are still very uncertain about how this will go. I think the American public is starting to pay attention now, but pretty soon it'll be summer. the time of backyard barbecues, et cetera, and things like that. I think President Biden is in the midst of quite an extensive diplomatic time period, having been in France and at the D-Day ceremonies, and now the G7, or heading towards the G7, and then hosting the NATO Summit in early July. The focus for the administration, and this is a very foreign policy involved president, has been Ukraine, but it is also now that focus is being overwhelmed by Israel-Hamas. But I do expect that the G7 trip is probably the last big foreign trip for the president. He's hosting everyone for NATO here in Washington, and then we'll just have to see as he begins to campaign.
Thank you so much. This is quite an overview of the Trump trials and what can be the impact of it. We will come back to the Biden-Trump debate and what points we can expect in the debates. But before we do that, you mentioned a couple of times the upcoming NATO summit. And let me turn to Ricardo and hear from him. What are your expectations from the NATO summit next month?
Thank you, Iana. And great to see João and Francis again, and you as well, Iana. Thank you for inviting me. I mean, before I go direct I will get to NATO summit, but if I can just make some sort of point in terms of how the transatlantic relationship has been evolving with all sort of these politics and elections and everything that is happening. It's actually interesting that some of these, as Francis was pointing out, a lot of these dates, and João had already done this, a lot of these dates coincide. Because if Mr. Trump is anointed on the 18th of July, that's probably also the date that Mrs. von der Leyen would be voted in the European Parliament. So there's been a lot of things that you can almost do sort of a parallel chronology of events in both sides of the Atlantic of what is happening when and with what potential consequences. Okay, for that to happen, Mrs. von der Leyen still needs to be, as João was expecting, that she will be the one that is appointed by the Council to go to a parliamentarian vote. So, but going to the transatlantic relation and some of the issues that have been preoccupying both sides of the Atlantic, and I think first and foremost Ukraine, and I believe there has been progress since we last spoke, because I think the last time we met, the Congress had not yet approved the substantial aid package to Ukraine, and this has now been done, and this has been very relevant. Of course, there's been delays in getting the aid and material and capabilities to Ukraine, but still this was really something that was very concerning for all of us, and this let's say this milestone has been overcome. So I think this was a positive development in that regard, and so I think that this is important. I think the other development is really where the one that basically several allies, including the US, have agreed that Ukraine can use some of these capabilities to strike military targets in Russian territory. This was a no-go for a very, very long time, and still, I mean, there's a lot of caution in this, but I believe that this is a relevant development. Then, of course, I mean, there are issues that are more contentious, such as how to use the Russian frozen assets. Americans and Europeans see relatively different in how to actually what to use and when to use, and there's also sort of a very strong, or there's a large legalistic debate about this as well, and what precedents this could create. Anyway, but these are some of the issues that I believe that are relevant from a transatlantic standpoint on foreign policy, and this issue in particular of the assets is likely to be discussed at the G7 summit already this week. So I think some of these issues will move on. The second point is which Francis had already alluded to, which is really Israel, Gaza, and now with the resolution approved in the Security Council with Russians' abstention. I think this is something where Europeans and Americans have converged over the months, and I think we might try to see, or at least see more movement there, and pushing the sides to really first. I mean, I think the full release of hostages and really to allow the hostages to come back home, but also then on I think, on the Israeli, really the ceasefire and allow humanitarian aid and try to really to stabilize let's say the region. Going now to your question on the NATO summit, I think President Biden's interview to the Time magazine, to a certain extent, has dampened a little bit what would have been some expectations on some European leaders and also I think of Ukrainians, when he said that, you know, membership is not yet in the cards, or I mean, if there was an expectation that Ukraine had of receiving, let's say, some sort of invitation to become a member, I think this is not in the cards, at least for this moment. I think what is on the table is really a concrete plan of security guarantees and this accession to become after, when there is peace. And so I think this is, I think President Biden in an interview, he said there will be peace in Ukraine when Russia will never sort of occupy Ukraine. So I think these are, so I think this has probably dampen a little bit what might be some of the expectations of the summit. Nevertheless, I believe what the summit, because it's the 75th year of the alliance, I think it's going to be a strong celebration of what the summit has actually achieved. And I think this is as important, I think, as we project to the future, that the success of the alliance is actually what might allow us in the future then to build a stronger, we will need to, I mean, the Europeans and Americans will need to redraw European security architecture in going forward. And so I think this is something, I think having time to also to celebrate the achievements of the alliance, I think it's an important one. Of course, with the political signal that the support to Ukraine is still there, I think it's going to be very important. If a last point, if I'm allowed, on, I mean, I won't get into trade because Fran knows much more about this. I think on trade there's been not much progress on transatlantic on transatlantic partners. It's based, and to be honest, I also didn't expect much of developments in transatlantic relations given the electoral cycles on both sides of the Atlantic. So I would not expect great developments in several of the issues or the irritants that are contentious between allies. But I would say that, I mean, there is an emerging problem that it also relates to NATO that is very important, which is Mr. Orbán. And although he might have been sort of defeated or not defeated, I mean, he still won the European Parliament elections. His party came first. He now is a strong contender, but he is becoming an obstacle on foreign policy, I think, not only at the EU level, but also in NATO. The moment that he starts questioning within NATO what might be the role of Hungary within the military command in terms of how support to Ukraine is delivered. Anyway, so I think we need to start thinking that although, I mean, I don't think Mr. Orbán would question accession, Hungary's participation in NATO, I think he can gradually become also a problem within NATO. And then if you project into the future and Mr. Trump is actually elected, then I think we would have a different problem that we will need to deal. But Mr. Orbán in particular is becoming a really big problem also for European foreign policy. And I think that now has more friends that joined the sort of, let's say, the European Parliament, although they are all very much divided, I mean, in terms of the foreign policy agenda that these more radical parties have. But I think this is something that we should keep an eye on, is how he is behaving, because it's clearly, I mean, his agenda is very much pro-Russia, pro-China. Hungary has become the biggest receiver of Chinese foreign direct investment at the moment in Europe. So I think we should also bear these issues in mind. Thank you, Iana. Sorry if I was too long.
No, thank you, Ricardo, for this overview. And you have reiterated the division and the weakness of the transatlantic community, so to say. So let me go back to the first kind of question, and let's start from the reverse to answer this question. I mean, we haven't really had an honest debate ahead of the European elections about the controversial issues. Do you think there will be an honest debate between Biden and Trump about the controversial issues, about Ukraine, about Russia, about China, about trade, and what will be the outcome of this debate? What will be the key takeaways for the transatlantic community from this debate?
Who starts first? Is it me or Fran? Do you want me to start?
Yeah.
Sure. No, I mean, listen, I think they have, if you look at how, and I also think a lot about this, what Trump has done in the past, what he might do in the future. So, and I think now, as Fran has told us so many times in these conversations, it's just gonna, and João as well, it's just gonna be worse. It's gonna be, if it's him, it's gonna be worse. I think in terms of the debate, in terms of foreign policy, I think he was first on trade. I think actually on trade there might not be so different, because free trade is not sexy any longer, and I think it's not sexy in the US, it's not sexy in Europe. So I think this is an agenda that has suffered over the past few years. So maybe there might be new ones. It was said, some of his advisors had said that he would scrap Trump, or maybe he would be critical of the IRA. I don't know if that would be the case. I'll leave that one to Francis. But I think one of the biggest issues will certainly be, Russia, Ukraine, support to Ukraine, how, both I think they will behave. Of course, I understand that US elections and the campaigns and the debates are very much about the issues that really worry Americans, which is jobs, healthcare, lifestyle issues, you name it. So I think these will be probably, and the state of the economy, these are normally the issues that really Americans want to hear about. But given the circumstances, I also don't think it's possible for you not to have a conversation, or at least a debate, about Russia, Russia's influence in the elections, how close Mr. Trump is of Mr. Putin, and so I think these things will come up. I think Israel and let's say the current situation in the Middle East will also be a topic. I think for reasons that everybody understands, because of the importance that Israel has in the US, but also how the young people in the US have reacted to what is happening in Gaza. So I think all of these issues are bound to be on the table. I think from Mr. I would say that from Mr. Biden, he will just defend the positions that he has had. I think Mr. Trump, he might say, you never know what will come out of his mouth. He's going to say that he was going to solve the Ukraine war, or the war in Ukraine, or in one day, and it's just so. But he might, he really might test sort of the system if he's elected in the debates. I think he will just be boisterous, as he normally is, and say that I can do it all by myself, and sort all the issues. So that's a little bit what I would expect from these debates. And again, it will be two very elderly gentlemen, so I also don't know how physically this. I don't think it probably, if they will sit them down or keep them standing up in those situations where they just sort of bounce back and forth. But anyway, but I'm looking forward to it. Also coincides with the European Council on the 27th of June. That's when the leaders will start debating really top jobs in Brussels. So it will be another occasion of coincidence of important events on both sides.
Definitely. Thank you, Ricardo. Let me move to Mrs. Burwell about this with the same questions. What will be the main key takeaways for the foreign policy from the Trump-Biden debate?
So I think it's going to be hard to have key takeaways that we don't already have, because it is very unusual for Mr. Trump to actually talk about policy in his speeches. He talks mostly about himself and how he has been wronged. We have had a few instances where he has been speaking to key groups on abortion, for example, speaking to evangelical groups who want to tighten restrictions on abortion, and he has tried to stay rather quiet about it. So he's not someone who goes out and does a policy brief and talks about the importance of picking this choice or another choice. I think the issues that we will hear about are 2 foreign policy issues and 3 domestic issues. One is the Ukraine war and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Here, yes, I think Ricardo is totally right. We will hear from Trump that he can solve it in a day or 2 just by meeting with Vladimir Putin. People have tried to make the case that Trump is too close to Putin and it doesn't stick with his supporters. On Israel, Hamas, so the President Biden, has shifted somewhat. And I think the resolution at the UN will be something that will help assuage the concerns of some Democrats who are questioning Israel's tactics. Trump will be very pro-Israel and pro-Netanyahu. But he will also, I think, stand on his record of the Abraham Accords as being able to bring peace to the region. And we'll just see whether that works for him or not. I think it probably will work for his supporters and for many Americans. The economy is the leading domestic issue. Americans are still in the situation where our economy is doing relatively well, but people don't believe it. And that's partly because of house prices escalating so much and some remaining pockets of inflation. It's possible that the public will feel better about the economy by the fall. There's, no sense in peaking too early with the economy and then having it start to go down a little bit before the election. You want it looking forward on the election, but we'll have to see on that. There are enough people who just don't feel like things are going in the right direction. And then migration. Last week, the Biden administration put into effect a policy that basically closes down the border. There's not been a huge amount of coverage. There was coverage for like one day. And I think that it's going to be very difficult for the administration to bring over voters that are not already on their side with this. And it is a very tough policy that a lot of liberal Democrats would have problems with. But the administration has not been able, with Congress, to get anything major through that would protect some of the people who have been here since childhood, while also addressing border issues. And as you will recall, the administration did have a plan to fund a lot more immigration judges, and that was not passed by Congress. I don't think that we will see the IRA reversed, the Inflation Reduction Act. We may see some of the elements of the guidance that came out when if Trump wins, a new Treasury Secretary will come in, and maybe there will be some revisions of the guidance. But it will be hard because people will have invested millions of dollars already in projects. So you can't like undo a wind farm. That's really hard to do. The final issue, of course, is abortion. And it is clear that this is something that brings people out to vote and to vote to preserve choice. We do not yet have a clear picture of how many states will have abortion-related measures on the ballot, but there will be a few, at least. And I think that this is one of the things that is going to drive turnout. And what we saw in the midterms was that those states that had those measures on the ballot, the Democrats did very well. So I think the debate on the 27th between the two presidential candidates, and Ricardo, I will bet money that they're both going to stand during the entire time. So just to show, that they're not old guys, is going to be, I think, somewhat chaotic, with Biden trying to make policy points and Trump trying to win the sympathy or engagement of voters and to portray Biden as, an old geezer who's not competent. So it's going to be a lot of slash and burn arguments, I think. Very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. And back to you, Ambassador. What would be your perception of the Biden-Trump debate, the key policy, foreign policy takeaways, and perspective from the EU side?
Yeah, well, my experience, my direct experience of two elections in America tell me that things only get serious really around the party conventions and after the party convention. That's when people start focusing and realizing, well, I will have to make a choice. I will have to choose between these guys and the other guys. And I agree with both Fran and Ricardo, but the point made by Fran that it's too early to make any prediction. And I think we should be attentive to that. The second aspect is that there's a lot of money being collected to be spent. The last time I spoke with my Democrat friends, they tell me that they are very comfortable with the kind of money that Biden has at his disposal. I would also add that we still need to know who Trump is going to choose for the vice president, which can be, we know that Biden has no choice, but Trump has a choice, and that choice can still make a difference. So anyway, a bit too early. On the issues, I had my list of issues, and I run through it quickly because it largely corresponds to Fran and Ricardo's lists. The economy, Trump's trials, abortion, migration/borders. Two issues that you did not mention, which are minor in this list, but still, the Black and Hispanic vote, what is going to happen there, and if you want to add the Muslim vote or the Arab vote in America, given the Gaza situation, there are doubts about the movements in this electorate between Biden and Trump, and they were key for Biden's victory, as we know. So that's one factor that I would, keep tracking up. And the other one is, of course, Mr. Kennedy and how much he can be disruptive. We know that this election, like last one, will be decided by a few thousand votes. There were 45,000 last time, I guess. So if this is the territory of decision, if there is a third candidate that can take away some votes from one or the other, it can still make a difference. So this will be my addition to the very good list that Fran and Ricardo have put forward. We have 5 months to go. The debate is important, but not crucial. We'll see what happens. The party conventions are a marketing operation, but important for the supporters. And we'll see what happens on the Middle East front, which is a big challenge for Biden, and what happens on the Ukraine one, which can be either used or not used by Trump to make Biden's life more difficult. So I think there's still a lot going on and about to happen. So I think we should maybe have our fourth conversation early September to check where things are.
Indeed. Thank you, and we will continue having this series probably after the second debate in September. But let me turn now to the audience and read out a question from them, and it's about in the event that Trump does win the election, how likely is it that he would use his conviction by a jury of his peers as a justification to use the courts and the legal system to retaliate against political opponents? And if so, would we expect a condemnation on this from the EU leaders? So I think that would be something from you, Mrs. Burwell, and maybe you can follow up, Ambassador, from the EU side.
So I do think that Trump will look for his enemies. And I think the good news for Hunter Biden is that he's having his trial now, and it's been low-key and it's been very public, but it's been focused on the issues of the trial, i.e., was he using drugs when he bought a gun, rather than being politicized during the trial itself. So, but I do think that Trump will pardon the January 6th insurrectionists, and he will go after those who prosecuted them. So I think that will be, whether he will succeed or not is not clear. And I think we have to wait until we get the Supreme Court ruling on the presidential immunity case appeal before we really have a flavor of how this Supreme Court how supportive of Trump it might be when he becomes president, if he becomes president. So I think we will see retribution aimed at the Justice Department and at those who have pursued cases against Trump. Whether it will come to the European leaders criticizing the United States as they have criticized some of their own members who have had, shall we say, judicial irregularities, is not clear to me.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything, Ambassador?
No, if you want a frank answer from me, I don't expect the European leaders to criticize President Trump. They will consider that a matter of internal business of the United States. They will have their own views. But I mean, if you think of what is at stake or will be at stake for the transatlantic relationship by January or February next year, in case Trump is elected, I mean, you have to have your hierarchy of interests and priorities. And the priority then will be to make sure that Trump is on the right side on Russia and Ukraine, and not too radical on China. I think this will be the main purpose on our side, and if that is made easier by not being too aggressive towards Trump's domestic behavior, that will be the bottom line.
Thank you. And let me turn to the next question. The race is tied. Some individual events may turn the tide, like a trial. What else to expect? What other factors can decisively influence the process other than the trial?
So I think the debate on January 27th is important because so many people who are sitting in the middle, so to speak, who are not committed to former President Trump, but trying to figure out and not sure they want to vote for either, have an impression that President Biden is not mentally competent. And I have to say that he did himself a lot of good at the State of the Union because he was clearly in charge. In fact, so much so that the Trump campaign started a rumor that he was given drugs before the performance, so that he performance-enhancing drugs, so to speak. It will be important because it will show a direct contrast between the two candidates, and it will make it harder for those who are watching, I think, they will be presented with evidence on the mental state and capacities of both men and their focus. So I think that is important because although everyone in Washington tends to go through the candidates' list of issues and say, oh, well, they're good on this issue or bad on this issue or good on this issue, the typical American voter doesn't do that. They vote for the person that they see during the campaign. And so things like the debates are important. Things like whether the candidate comes to your home state and you actually get to see them is important. So those things I think will be more important than the issue by issue breakdown.
If I may, I do agree with Fran, and also on television, what people retain is an impression of the candidate. It's not. I mean, if I remember the debate between Trump and Hillary Clinton, it was terrible for Clinton. From some of us, it was terrible for Trump, but it turned out to be very good for Trump. So I agree with that. But my point, in the same vein, by the way, is to say, for me, the most, the unexpected situation that could rock the boat is a physical issue with President Biden. If ever, and God forbid, he has any health issue that would sort of, confirm the idea of those that think he's not fit, I think that will be a game changer in terms of the dynamics of the election. Also because his vice president is not necessarily extraordinarily popular. I mean, the whole issue of, are we electing someone that may not be able to finish the mandate, and he has a VP whom we don't really know that well. I think this could be a game changer.
Thank you. Ricardo, would you like to add anything on this?
No, not on this. I think enough has been said. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question about will Hunter Biden's gun trial have an impact on the elections and on Joe Biden's chances to win? Maybe we can answer that quickly.
I think that the trial confirms people's views. So those who think that Hunter Biden is a criminal and there were illegal dealings with his father, they're going to continue to believe that. What this trial has done is also, though, given the president the opportunity to say that he's not going to pardon his son. He's made that very clear, that if Hunter Biden is convicted, he won't pardon him. So that's a difference with the former president. And also to say that he loves his son, who has struggled with addiction, et cetera. And I think for many families in the United States, that resonates to some degree. So, but I think basically this trial is just going to confirm people's views.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. The more European question directed to Ambassador and also to you, Ricardo. How could EU, by adjusting its foreign policy, be better prepared for a possible Trump re-election? Maybe we can start from you, Ricardo.
Listen, I don't know if there clearly, the Europeans, we need to do adjustments in our foreign policy, irrespective if Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump wins. I think the debates that we are having on security and defense, let's say the investment that we need to do in that area needs to happen whether Mr. Trump or President Biden are there. I think this is something that Europeans need to do. I think on other issues, we can anticipate what could happen and be prepared for it. And I think to a large extent, we have had that conversation has been ongoing. Okay, I know that there's also a lot of wait and see what might happen and see whether the election of Mr. Trump does materialize. But DigiTrade has been working on potential scenarios of what might happen if Mr. Trump comes back and he starts imposing tariffs. I think we should also be prepared, for example, that if Mr. Trump is elected, that he will withdraw again from the climate Paris agreement. But we also know, and we have actually been through that, so I think we might know how to handle those situations a little bit better this time around. I think there's also the possibility that Mr. Trump will become, as Francis was mentioning, that he will be very, very pro-Israeli or Israel. He will be very against Iran. He will be very tough, I think, on Iran. So I think these are issues that we should sort of, to a certain extent, anticipate and be prepared for, and then modulate also our foreign policy according to our interests. And I think that's really the best way that we can do. And of course, the better that they can be aligned with the, let's say, transatlantic foreign policy goals, the better, naturally. But I think that to a certain extent, this would be a return to the future. Or, we've gone through this future. Having Mr. Trump sort of as a president, it's not the first time. It's true that it might be much more resentful and that he will come after the EU probably in a much more stronger fashion, also because probably he will have less adults in the room. He will have less people that would actually be comfortable in sitting in his presidency. There have been less of these more sort of reasonable, middle of the road American pundits or politicians or people that normally work in the administration. So I think we might see a much more aggressive tone, but we've been through that. I think we just also then need to set our goals and just keep going.
Yeah, thank you. Over to you, Ambassador.
No, I largely agree with Ricardo. I would add maybe one element. I think we could do better at the G7 level and G20 as well in trying to find bridges with Trump, certainly with a China element in it, but sometimes you need a common sort of adversary to unite a disgruntled family. So I think we could do better on the G7 kind of module. of bringing countries like who are members of the G7, but those who are often invited, like the Australias and Koreas of this world, to identify in Trump's agenda things that we can do together that can suit him or be useful for him, and around that trying to soften him on Russia, basically. That would be my sort of tactical point.
Thank you.
I jump in and say that I think from an American perspective, it is important that the EU presents itself as a strong global actor. You can note that Mr. Trump has or believes he has good relations with many leaders with whom he disagrees, but because he thinks that they are strong people with a lot of control. So the EU is always going to be a bit messy. That's just the way it is. I don't expect Ursula von der Leyen to become President Xi of China. That would not be the right thing to do. But I think it's important that the EU knows what it wants. And too often, European commentators and sometimes even officials come over to Washington, and their focus seems to be on the relationship and what they have to do to keep the relationship, rather than what are their objectives and how can they work with the United States. And it's a subtle difference, but I think that it makes a big difference when you're dealing with someone like Trump. And I expect that I'm not optimistic that a Biden too is going to suddenly loosen its policies on trade. So I think whomever you have leading the United States, the economic opportunities between the US and the EU are going to be constrained to some degree. But I think that makes it even more important that the EU focus on the competitiveness debate that is going on there now, the Letta report, the forthcoming Draghi report. Those are the types of things. A growth rate that looks good, investments by major companies. Those are the types of things that will make Europe stand out more if there is a Trump administration.
Yeah, the other one, Fran, agreeing with you, is regulation. And the Brussels effect, we need to put it on for the steroids, I'd say, in order to tell America that we have a strength there. And if I may just make a point about my last position as ambassador to the UK, I think there's a strong case here, particularly after the forthcoming election in Britain, for closer links between the EU and the UK. And if Biden wins with the United States on a number of issues from China to Russia, but also to how do we organize the new globalization scheme? How do we move forward to protect our economic interests on the world scale? I think there's a lot there. That includes regulation. That includes artificial intelligence and how we kind of prepare for this new world. And so hopefully if President Biden is reelected, and if we have a more forward-looking government in Britain, we should look at that. And that involves, again, as I said, the G7 approach as well.
Thank you. And we have more questions in the from the audience, but I'm afraid not enough time to answer all of them. I mean, the questions are mostly about Trump's return and its consequences on the defense and cooperation, as well as main difference between Biden and Trump regarding China policy, and whether Russia's escalation in Ukraine can influence the US campaign. If we can very briefly answer, you can pick and choose which one you'd like, maybe in 30 seconds. If it's not fair to answer this in 30 seconds, but if you can try, maybe we can, maybe you can answer the defense cooperation, Ricardo, and we will move to the Ukraine, Russia's escalation in Ukraine with the ambassador, and we'll finish about China policy with Mrs. Burwell.
I mean, again, as I said, I think transatlantic defense cooperation is going to be an issue that is going to be relevant with Mr. Trump or with Mr. Biden, because there is, I mean, of course, there is a deliberate effort of Europeans to spend more European, so to say, in their defense industry. But of course, I mean, the American defense industry is a very important one in, let's say, in the global sort of picture. I think if we are allies, it's normal that there will be, and also in, let's say, in this issue that also the EPC has written a lot about sort of synchronizing the short-term needs that Europeans need to, let's say, in support to Ukraine with the long-term objectives in terms of bringing more capabilities. Some of the things that we might need now over the shelf, they're made by Americans. So let's just buy them. And if we just need it, let's just, you know, be pragmatic about this. But of course, I also understand that we need in this discussion that Fran was just mentioning about increasing competitiveness of European economy. I mean, the defense industry is part of this discussion as well, and so that needs to be done with that sort of mindset that we need to support our industry. But of course, I think there is, I mean, then we are part of the same alliance. So it's also important that our defense industries are actually somewhat sort of working along the same lines in terms of interoperability, regarding all these issues that I believe that are relevant in going forward. So I think this is an issue that Europeans will need to deal with Mr. Trump or with Mr. Biden, because it's actually more about the industry than the leaders themselves, I would say.
Thank you, Ricardo. Over to you, Ambassador.
What was the question? Sorry, you had a different question from.
How the Russia's escalation in Ukraine can influence the U.S. campaign if that happens.
Oh yeah. Well, what do I know? But I would not expect President Putin to do excessively ahead of the election, right? If I can put myself in his shoes, God forbid, I would say that you will wait to see what comes out of the American election, and if Trump wins, things could change for him. So I would expect the pressure to continue, the tension to continue, but at this point in time, I would not expect a huge qualitative change on the theater, because the American element is critical. That's my expectation, but I could be totally wrong. What is clear for me, in any case, is that Europe needs to get its act together in terms of reinforcing its support to Ukraine on all fronts, and in being clear about the need to build up a defense and security capability. That is particularly obvious. This being said, going back to the beginning of our conversation, we are at the beginning of a transition to a new cycle. And we have, we'll have to choose leaders in Europe. Some of our national leaders have been weakened by these elections. Some are going through elections. In France, we're talking about calendars. Now you have the US calendar, the EU calendar, and the French calendar. And the elections are in between the G7, the European Council, 2 European Councils, the NATO Summit, the Ukraine Peace Summit. All this is interlinked in terms of calendar and make things more complicated for Europe. So my hope is that we will not be too distracted or too weakened by the transition that we are starting right now in Europe between now and November or December.
Thank you. And back to you, Mrs. Burwell, about the position towards regarding China, main differences between Trump and Biden's approach.
So first, I would say that it's crucial as we head towards the NATO summit for European countries to make very clear how much they are supporting Ukraine. Because one of the weaknesses, or one of the arguments used by those in the United States who would weaken our support, is that Europe is not doing enough, that we're doing this by ourselves. And it's not true, but it needs more public. I do think we need to also recall that the Wales commitments of 2% were for 2024. And Trump will undoubtedly claim that he was key in pushing for higher spending. We can argue the merits of that, but he will, I think you let him have that. So it's a good way if he comes into office to kind of build bridges. On China, I think that the difference is going to be in the level of cooperation with Europe and moderation versus unpredictability and doing things suddenly and perhaps without full consideration of the consequences. So I think that we have seen a convergence, not quite exactly the same, between the EU and the Biden administration on China. We're all watching to see what the results will be of the electric vehicles investigation, as well as wind turbines and medical devices, and what the retaliation may be, if there is retaliation. I think that will be an indicator of EU seriousness, even if it is, I'm not one who really favors that kind of thing, but I think politically, the signal it sends will be important. With Biden being reelected, I think that you will continue to see discussions about what else is a strategic asset that needs to be protected, and what other areas of our supply chains need to be guarded. And I think there will be some tension between the US and the EU over some of the things such as forced labor and other sorts of things that will affect companies that have global supply chains. With Trump, it's going to be much less predictable. He often says that he will do something and then doesn't do it. That's not, I think that's one thing. So if he says he's going to put huge tariffs on China, he is also stoking up leverage for negotiations with China on certain things. And I'm sure that he thinks that he can go to Beijing or meet Xi and make some kind of an arrangement. So I think we just don't know at this point. But I would look at some of his statements as bargaining leverage, as currying favor with voters who are anti-China, and we'll just have to see what happens. But to be prepared.
All right, we will have to be prepared indeed. Thank you so much, around for your insightful comments, analysis, and excellent overview of what is happening in the transatlantic community within this year of elections and run up to the U.S. elections as well. We have focused on Trump trials over the past 1 hour and 10 minutes, roughly. We have also unpacked the results of the European Parliament elections and its impact on transatlantic relations. We have touched upon the upcoming Republican and Democratic national conventions, as well as Biden-Trump debate, where the main foreign policy discussion points would be most likely Ukraine, Israel, Hamas, economy, migration, trade, abortion, and voters. We have also unpacked the NATO Summit and what we expect in July, and we are definitely prepared for the events that are coming on 3-layered calendar in US, EU, and particularly in EU in France. So thanks around. We will continue our run up to the US election series. So stay tuned, and we are also working on the upcoming NATO Summit. So you will find more analysis at the EPC's website as well. Thank you, and wishing you a nice afternoon and evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Good morning and bye. Ciao.
Bye. See you.